Consumer prices are rising each month, but each month they're rising less than they did the month before. And I should have said right at the outset that when you hear an inflation rate, and the most recent one you've heard for Canada was 3.8% in September, we're talking about a year-over-year change in inflation. So it was 3.8% higher in September of this year than it was in September 2022. So we have actually had a whole bunch of months of disinflation in Canada, from the peak of inflation in June of 2022 when it got up to 8%, down for several months. It did go up a tiny bit, but we actually have seen that happening. And then the third one is deflation, and that's when all prices, or almost all prices, are falling compared to a year ago. We have not seen that very often, and this comment may surprise you, but that's actually a good thing. So let's go on to the next slide and try and deal with the question is how is inflation measured? Because, and I think it's important that we spend a minute on this, because I think it gives the measures some credibility when you read them in the press. So we have a monthly consumer price index. It's prepared by Statistics Canada, which, by the way, is a terrific statistical agency. I'm not going to say they never make a mistake. They occasionally do, but they're a really good agency, and we're very glad to have them. So it's a monthly index. Let's go to the next one. And it's a survey of retail prices across the country. So you can, when you get the inflation number, you're getting a number from, pardon me, from the Pacific Ocean to the Atlantic Ocean, from the 49th parallel to the Arctic Ocean. So it's a national number. Now, if you want, you can go on the Statistics Canada website if you have absolutely nothing else to do, and you can get a feel for what it was in BC or the Territories or Prince Edward Island, whatever. And by the way, the provincial numbers don't usually vary a lot among themselves or with the national number, but there are times when it does. So let's go to the next little thing here, because this is a really important point, because it tells us what we're measuring. And what we're measuring is pure price change. And the way you do that is keep the basket of goods and services the same all the way through. Now, Statistics Canada does a different survey. They do this survey every month. They do a different survey when they ask us, consumers, what we buy and how much of it we buy. So they can weight the index. They can know that we do so much on food and so much on transportation and so much on housing and so on. So they have that, so they know what we buy. Now, the problem with doing it this way, where you keep the basket of goods and services the same, is that obviously consumers change their preferences. They did that during the pandemic, and we have new products on the market that people buy. Old products go away. So periodically, this survey is updated so that at any given time, it's representative of what we are actually buying. So let's go on to the next one. So what rate of inflation is ideal? Well, there's this kind of a Goldilocks aspect to this, as the next one will tell us. We don't want it too high. That really doesn't need any explanation. High inflation stretches our budgets, makes it way more difficult, and for some people, it's been a really, really serious economic hit, the inflation that we've had. So we don't want it too high. And the next one may surprise you, not falling prices. Now, you may be already wondering why you came today if you're listening to a guy who says he doesn't like falling prices. In fact, I do. If there's a sale and there's something I want or I need, I'll be the first one in line to buy it. But a sale doesn't last for very long, and not everything is on sale at the same time. The falling prices I'm talking about here would be if either all or almost all consumer prices were falling. We don't want that. And if you think about it, it'll become clear. If all prices were falling, and let's say that you needed a new gizmo. A gizmo can be anything you want it to be. And you go to the store, and you look at the price of the gizmo, and it's less than it was the previous month and the month before that. So you say to yourself, well, if I wait till next month, it's probably going to be less expensive. And you wait till next month, and you go, and sure enough, it's less expensive. And you say, well, maybe I should wait again. So you can see where this is going. If everybody does that, pretty soon consumer spending stops, and consumer spending is about 60% of economic output, economic activity in this country. So that's why we don't want falling prices. But let's get to something with the next one that we do want, and that is the lowest sustainable inflation rate. And economists and policymakers have pretty much settled on the fact that it's 2% a year. Now, 2% is obviously not nothing. In a perfect world, it would be 0%, but I'll tell you why it's not sustainable. 10 years, if you compound it, it's about 21.5%. The reason that that's the lowest sustainable rate is the nature of the policy tool that tries to keep inflation in check, and that policy tool is interest rates, the stuff that's been going up and giving us a hard time. Now, interest rates as a policy tool are very effective, but they are not precise. They're not a surgical scalpel, they're more like a broad axe. And the problem is that if you try to aim for 0, the danger is that you will wind up with less than 0, and you'll have falling prices, and you'll have a big economic problem. So that's why 2% is the sustainable rate, and that is the rate that central banks use in the United States, Canada, Europe, Japan, England, just about anywhere. So let's talk for a second about what affects inflation. And if we go to the next line on this slide, the big thing is demand versus supply. And it stands to reason, if you've got too much demand and constant supply, prices are going to get pushed up. And if you have constant demand and limited supply, prices get pushed up. But if you have too much demand and a cut in supply, they really, really get pushed up. And that's basically what happened. And that's basically why we've had this big inflation. The next one is external shocks. We're a very open economy, and some of you all look very young to me, but some of you may remember the oil price shock in the early 70s when oil went from $3 to $12 a barrel. That was a big shock, and inflation went up. So we get these kinds of external shocks in Canada that can make it difficult. But maybe I shouldn't have used the word shocks, because some of the external influences are actually good. I'm going to show you a chart in a few minutes which shows you that for many years we had low and relatively stable inflation of less than 2%. And one of the reasons we were able to do that, our policies were pretty decent, but because the price of goods, with increased international trade, the price of goods were falling gently in some cases and keeping the rate of inflation down. So external shocks can be a positive as well as a negative. The next one is also an external issue, and that is currency fluctuations. We have what is called a floating currency. We tend to measure the Canadian dollar against the US dollar, and if the Canadian dollar is falling, that tends to push inflation up. If the dollar is rising, it'll push inflation down. So that can also be an influence. And I believe we've got one more. Economic and monetary policies. So economic policies would be largely government spending policies. The jargon term is fiscal policy, but don't worry about that. So it would be taxation policies and spending, and it's pretty obvious how it works. If you raise taxes or lower spending, you're going to slow the economy down and cool inflation out. If you do the opposite, if you lower taxes, increase spending, if the economy is bumping up against capacity, then you're probably going to raise prices. So those are the major influences. So where have we been? Well, this chart shows us the year-over-year percentage change in the consumer price index starting in 1995 and ending up in September of 2003. Now, if you look at it, or you may need to take my word, depending on how well the charts are showing up, you can see that even though there were fluctuations, if you average that out, it's not difficult to imagine the actual number, which is actually about 1.8% over that year. And if you want to check that out, go on the Bank of Canada website. They've got an inflation calculator, and you can prove it for yourself. And then starting in April of 2021, it started to go up. It hit a peak of 8%, utterly unacceptable in June of last year, got down to about 3.3, and you could just see that little uptick in the slide got up to 3.8, and that's the most recent number. We'll probably get a new one next week. So we have made some progress, but we're not there yet. So we'll go to the next slide and have an international view. Now, this slide is on a different scale and a different time period, but the reason I'm showing it is that you can see that Europe and the US had higher inflation rates than Canada. They had the big bump. You can see Canada there. Japan, which had been fighting deflation, falling prices for years and years, saw a big rise of inflation, got up to 4% at one point. And the only one that was offside here was China, and that was a function of the very strict lockdown policies to try and get rid of COVID that the Chinese government imposed. So it's not just a Canadian situation, it's been an international problem. So let's go on to the next slide, and quickly, what went wrong? Well, the first item was international supply chain constraints. We had got used to globalization and international trade working really smoothly, and we ran into all sorts of problems. The one that was the most talked about was the chips to run the computer systems in motor vehicles. A lot of them are made in Asia, Taiwan especially. They were locked down during the pandemic. And if you've tried to buy a car recently, you know some of them are still scarce. It's getting better. There were other supply chain issues. Price of shipping went way up. Other bottlenecks in places, really all COVID related. And if you look at the analysis that the Bank of Canada did, you learn that that was the biggest problem, the biggest contributor to this huge blow up in inflation. And things are getting better. So the next one, unexpectedly strong consumer demand. Now, one of the difficulties about doing economics is that in retrospect, you're a genius. You know exactly what happened. Looking forward, you're maybe not so smart. And I'm really being kind to economists here. We look back and we realized that we were really confined very much. We were not worshiping in this building. I first met Jessica over a screen. I was delighted to see that she was a real person. And we couldn't go out to restaurants. We couldn't do this, we couldn't do that. We did increase our spending on goods. We drove up the price of lumber. We didn't, but lots of people were renovating their houses because all of a sudden they were there 24 hours a day. And then the constraints went off, and I think they went off a little more quickly than the policymakers expected. So all of a sudden, we're out buying stuff, and we're buying stuff that doesn't exist, or we're trying to buy stuff that doesn't exist, and that was a problem. So the next one is the Ukraine war. We knew that it was a possibility, but only one person knew, A, if it was going to happen, and B, when it was going to happen, and he wasn't willing to tell us. So we had a couple of pretty serious problems. Energy prices shot up. The Europeans discovered, to their horror, that they had counted on an unfriendly country to supply them with natural gas. And they have had to make some big adjustments, but to their credit, they have made it. But also, Russia is a huge oil producer, and there was great uncertainty about what was going to happen to that oil, how oil markets were going to be supplied. So energy prices were a problem. Agricultural prices were also a big problem, and you know about that because you see it in your food bill. So let's go on to the next one. Tax and spending policies and monetary policies. So this is where we look back and say, did we do the right thing? Now, I go to one economics conference a year these days, and I heard a really good paper by a woman who is on the Bank of Canada Monetary Policy, or Bank of England Monetary Policy Committee. And she talked about what her thinking was to going into how she would vote on monetary policy decisions made by the Bank of England. And she said, you know, what I have to figure out is which type of wrong would I rather be? And that's difficult. You don't want to make serious decisions that are going to affect the economic well-being of millions of people on that basis. But that's often what you have to do. And I think when we get a chance to get some perspective, we may have seen that overall, the government intervention here was probably more than was necessary. Now, some people needed every cent that the government gave them. But I think we may come to the conclusion that maybe they did more than they needed to. But before I criticize them, I stop and say, yeah, but what if they'd done too little? And that's the difficulty. And that's why I'm not about to give them a hard time. The same thing with monetary policy. It was really stimulative. And in retrospect, maybe it shouldn't have been so stimulative. And I think if you had a quiet chat with Tip Macklem, the governor of the Bank of Canada, and if you promise not to tell anybody, he would probably say, yeah, I wish we'd tightened up sooner. But I listened to a year-end speech that he gave in December of last year, and he talked about all these things, and he said, we could not have predicted them all coming together at the same time. And but he said, we learned a bunch of stuff, and more credit that he was willing to get up and say that. So what's being done to bring inflation down? Well, first item on the agenda is government stimulus is being pared back. The finance minister does not call me to ask. I have had calls from the finance minister, but not lately. And I would argue that it's not being pared back enough. The deficit will go from about $44 billion last fiscal year to about $40 billion this year. And I think that's still too high. But nevertheless, there is some help coming there. The next one is that the supply chains are being enhanced. This takes time. It takes 3 or 4 years to build a new chip factory, for example, and or to you've heard about this onshoring trend that maybe we're not going to rely on imports so much, and we can talk about that in the question period if you want. So that's helping things a bit, and then there's another one. The Bank of Canada is raising interest rates, and I need to be really clear and really specific and really blunt about what rising interest rates are intended to do. They are intended to slow or stop the economy. It's just that simple. And I mention that because I was talking to a friend the other day who's a very smart guy, does very well in his job, and his question to me was, well, why would the government let interest rates get that high? And I said, because that's what's necessary to solve the problem. So it is a blunt and difficult way of doing it. And it's ironic that the Bank of Canada has had to do this because possibly 20 years ago, the bank made a major change in its policy. Rather than waiting for inflation to be obvious, it would use a magnifying glass and look for the tiniest signs and then start to raise interest rates a little. And the idea being that if you raise rates a little at the beginning, you won't have to raise them very much. And that worked really well until coming out of the COVID and everything came together and everything blew up. Okay, where's inflation going? Well, if we go to the next line, it's now at 3.8%, about half of what it was at its peak. So we've made progress. But we still have a way to go. So if we hit the next one, the Bank of Canada forecasts 2% by the fourth quarter of 2025. So 2% is the target. And again, we need to be really clear. The Bank of Canada will achieve that target no matter what. Now, there's lots of things we could discuss about that. Should they be looking at individual price components rather than the total? There's been a big debate in the economics community in the last few months. But I think I'm pretty safe in saying that's what's going to happen. Now, when I first saw that forecast, I thought, 2 years? That really seems a bit much. I think a couple of things are behind that forecast. One is the Bank of Canada is making, again, it's, which way would they rather be wrong? They're making a conservative forecast because the one thing the bank does not want to do is leave interest rates down for 6 or 8 months and then start raising them again, because that erodes its credibility. So they're going to keep at it. They've paused for the moment, but they're going to keep at it until they think they've got it right. The other thing is that the last mile to getting down to 2%, I think the bank feels is going to be difficult. Now, more rate increases possible. If you follow the financial press, you know that analysts are jumping, yelling, screaming to say that the interest rate increases are done. They just want that so much, and I understand, we all want it. And then maybe the stock market will do better and we can stop worrying about it. And they may be done, but my advice would be, let's be cautious, because we're still not there and we still have to go that last mile to get it down to where it will be. And that will be a big benefit. So I think when one is making decisions these days, we got to be a bit cautious. So how will we know when interest rates will stabilize? Well, a couple of things to look for. The next line tells us that we need to have 2% inflation for several months. 1 month won't do it, 2 months won't do it. I don't know how many months we need, but the bank is going to have to be sure that it's actually going to work that way. And the next one is one that isn't talked about. Consumer and business inflation expectations have to fall back to 2%. Inflation expectations are really important. And for years, they were anchored at 2%, and that was great. And the reason they're important is that if we expect inflation to be high, we're likely to go out and buy stuff, more stuff than we would normally, because it'll be more expensive next month, next year, and we can make inflation go higher. So the Bank of Canada is as concerned to get inflation expectations down as it is to get inflation down to 2%. So those are the things that we can look for. Now, what about interest rates? Well, I picked a forecast of 5-year government bond yields, which is going to show up here. And the reason I picked that one is because 5-year government bond yields tend to parallel mortgage rates fairly closely. They don't mirror them exactly, but they're really close. And I think the one that I like, is credible, is 100 basis points over the next year, another 70 basis points the following year. And there's one more point on this chart to remember, that they are not going to go down to the lows of the pandemic. And if you click one more time, JC, there we go. The pandemic lows were very, very, very low. And look, I got a lot of sympathy for young people. I remember when interest rates were not, when mortgage rates were 19%. And I'm sure you guys are all too young to remember that, but I do. And the younger people don't. And it makes it far more difficult for them to adjust to what's going on. So let's leave inflation and talk for a minute about economic growth. First point is, how do we get it? What affects it? And there are a couple of long-term factors. So the long-term influences, the first one, and it'll be the next line, the number of hours that are worked each week or each year by Canadian workers. Now, that obviously depends on your job and what it is, but what it really depends on is how many Canadian workers there are. Statistics Canada defines working age as 14 to 64 or 65. About 65.2% of those are in the labor force, and about 90, if I could do some math in my head, about 94%, 94.5% are actually working. But the problem is that we're an aging population. And as people age and they retire, and there are fewer people to do it, which is why we're welcoming immigrants to this country, but then that plan is made more difficult by the fact that we have this housing crisis. So people come and we don't know where to house them. So that's a challenge. The second one is how productive those workers are. Now, I'm not talking about people who play computer games at work when they should be working. You know who you are. I'm talking about whether the organization you work for has equipped you to be as effective as you can be. If it's a manufacturing plant, is there machinery and equipment that is the latest, the most efficient? Do you have the best computer systems? Has the workflow been organized in the most efficient manner? And then there's stuff that you can't control. Are there roads and transportation facilities you can get stuff in and get stuff out? Do you have communication infrastructure? All these things. We know, in theory, how to improve productivity. And we've been doing a lot of it in this country. But the fact is our productivity performance is lousy. And I will quickly tell you a story. I was at this conference this summer. I talked to a guy who runs a non-government, non-profit think tank. And all it does is study productivity. And he does research. He gets papers from all over the world. He probably knows more about productivity than anybody else. So we're having this discussion over a coffee. And he said, the problem is we still don't really know the answers. And if he doesn't know the answers, who does? So we know we've got a big problem, and we're really not sure what we can do about it. And that's probably not cheerful news, but I'm being very realistic here. Okay, let's go on to the next one, short-term influences. First line is going to say interest rates. I think I've made the point. You raise them, you slow things down, you lower them, you speed them up. Next one, government tax and spending policies. I got to stand in the right place here. And the next one is demand for Canadian exports. We export about a third of what we produce, so that's really important. Okay, let's keep going here. How's the Canadian economy doing? Well, it's stalled at the moment. It's going to be slow for the next year, and the next point I think will reiterate that. The unemployment rate's still low, but it's likely to rise, and the problem is there are a lot more people that had fixed rate mortgages. They're going to have to renew them at higher rates, and that's going to hurt. So not great for the next year, but if we go to the next slide, where's it likely going? Well, the next point I think is going to tell us that it'll be slow for the next year or so, but then it'll pick up, probably to 1.5% to 2% a year, which doesn't sound like much, but it's not bad. So here's a picture. Last slide in this section, you can see that it starts in Q4 of 19, before the pandemic. You can see the effects of COVID, big declines, big increases. At the very end of this is the second quarter. You can't really tell. There was a tiny decline, and when we get to third quarter, at the end of this month, there'll probably be another tiny decline. And then all the analysts will be screaming recession. You know what? If an economy grows 0.1%, or if it declines 0.1%, that's 0.2 different. If it declines for 2 quarters, 0.1, it's a recession. So just ignore the nonsense about the screaming and yelling about recession. The economy isn't going anywhere, but we're not talking disaster. And I think you've got to remember that. Okay, let's just talk for a second about why economists are having trouble getting it right. So we go to the next slide, and what do? Well, let's roll down the list. They study how the economy works. They derive theories about economic behavior. They make economic forecasts. They communicate them to their clients, wherever. So the next slide, what could possibly go wrong? And the answer is lots. Okay. Economists do face some challenges. We'll go to the next slide. And the economy has a lot of parts, a really lot of parts, and a lot of decision makers. They're constantly changing. And the third point, each part has effects on other parts. So it is a complex thing to grasp. And to understand it is a bit of a challenge. Economists make mistakes, and I got 3 slides of economist sins for you here. And one of the things is they obsess over numerical minutiae. They argue publicly about whether it's going to be 2.1% or 2.3%. Ignore that, because as good as Statistics Canada is, it spills more than that in adding up this very big thing called the economy. So the next sin is they obsess over mathematical models. Now, mathematical models are really important. They really help you analyze the economy. But, as the next one says, you got to step back and say, do they make sense? I once got a phone call, this is way back, from a guy, an economist, big manufacturing company. He said, Peter, the unemployment rate's going to go to 14%. I said, no, it isn't. He said, the model says it is. And my reply was, yeah, but the model hasn't considered the fact that if it gets even to 10%, the federal government will step in with all sorts of stimulus. So it's not going to go to 14%. And this guy made the mistake of not stepping back from the model and saying, does it make sense? So that's one of the sins. So let's keep going here. They oversell what they can do. This really bugs me. When an economist tells you that something is going to grow at 3%, they don't really know. None of us know. We all want to know the future. There are lots of psychologists out there who says that if we knew the future, we would not be happy at all. I once hired a young woman who did a great job, and she impressed me for all sorts of reasons in the job interview. But the thing that really impressed me is she said, I believe that a forecast is a well-reasoned guess. And she's right. She's right. So I think economists can do other things than some of the things they do, and we can talk about that in questions if you want. Okay, what's next? They rely on one infallible indicator. The whole world wants the one infallible indicator that will tell them what's happening. And I've seen these things come and go. This will come out, and everybody says, yeah, that's the one that will tell you what the Bank of Canada is going to do. And after a year, they say, well, that didn't work. And people are still doing it. I was part of a discussion the other day, and a well-known Canadian economist was quoted talking about the U.S. economy, and he said, I've got this one infallible slide. And I'm being silly here, but it's, the inverse of the 4-year mortgage rate divided by the upverse of the GDP, whatever it was. He said it's never failed to forecast a recession in the U.S. We're going to have a recession. Well, the last quarter, the U.S. economy grew at 4.9%, almost getting a speeding ticket. So there are no infallible indicators, no matter who says what. Next one, they're too anxious to get headlines. If somebody asked me to go in front of a camera and do an interview right now on where we're going, I'd say what I said to you. You know, it's going to be slow. It's not going to be a disaster. We're going to muddle through. And nobody would pay any attention. If I got on TV and said, you have no idea how bad this is going to be. People are going to be starving in the streets. There are going to be riots. Everybody would listen. And the problem with some economists is they care more about getting the headlines than about doing something useful. Okay, it's all different this time. This one also makes me livid. Every time there's a downturn, somebody comes out and says, well, it's all different this time. Somebody wrote a book after the great brouhaha in 2008, 2011 with that title. It's never all different. Every downturn will have something that's different. But what makes me furious about this is that it pulls the rug out from you people. All of the things that you might use to get you through an unstable time, and they're saying, well, it doesn't matter. And it's simply not true. I will concede that there were things different during the pandemic, but then anybody want to tell me the last time we actually chose to shut the economy down? I don't think that's happened before. But that one, it's never all different. So let's see what else we've got here. Yeah, they ignore political economy. This is the last sin. There are some really, really important changes happening globally. For decades, we economists could assume that people and policymakers made decisions based on economic logic. And that is eroding. Brexit was the first example. It was the dumbest economic decision I've ever seen in my life. But people had these great visions. You know, I understand they were fed up with the EU regulation, but it was a really dumb economic decision. Decisions are being made based on political ideology, and that's not a good thing. So economists have to take this into account if they're going to be any use. Okay, so much for the sins. If you're going to listen to economists, first of all, pick your sources carefully. We can talk about that if you want. Be skeptical of dramatic forecasts. And probably the most important, if what they say doesn't make sense, disregard it. Because you are all economists, you're all making economic decisions. And I forgot one of the sins of economists. We talk too much, so I'm going to stop talking now. And we are going to go to questions and discussion. And I see it right there. I was warned that this person would ask them.
I've always wondered about a guaranteed income in Canada.
Yeah.
Spain, a guaranteed income.
Yeah, that's a great question. So a guaranteed income would make sure that everybody had income at a certain specified level. And I had always thought, and others had always thought, that this makes a lot of sense because it would get rid of a whole lot of administrative costs, and you'd have one program. What has surprised me is some research. I think a lot of it happened out at some universities in British Columbia that said that, in fact, what I just said may be true, that you could make a much more efficient system, but that it may not serve the people who are most dependent on a guaranteed income, as well as having very specific programs. Now, I think the jury is still out on this research, but I think it does have some credibility. So it may not be the be-all and the end-all that I certainly thought it was. And I think we've got to wait for some more research to find out. So thank you for that. Yeah. Any others? I see a hand. There, yeah.
Over the last couple of years, I think inflation has really been affected by oil prices and supply chain issues, particularly food.
Yeah.
How is increasing interest rates ever going to help that?
That's a question that I hoped I would get. And I hoped I would get it because there was an article in the other paper that, again, I get very passionate about this stuff. An economist who said Bank of Canada will not be able to solve this just because exactly what you said. It's difficult, but I take you back to the early 70s. And things were really hitting the fan. I mean, $12 is nothing now, but when oil went from $3 to $12, everybody is saying what any common sense would tell you. So we are in deep trouble because we cannot do without oil. And what we learned is, and oil is still a big source of energy, But what we learned is that oil, economists have a term, and I've tried to avoid jargon, and it's called price elasticity. And all that means is, if the price of something goes up, how likely is it that people will buy less? Well, the price elasticity of oil is not very high, I agree. But what we learned is a couple of things. For doing various things, we did manage to do with less. And I have forgotten the numbers, and I apologize. But if you were to look at the numbers for the world economy or the US or the Canadian economy and look at the amount of oil consumed per dollar of output, you would learn that that amount of oil consumed is way less than it was going into the 1970s. Now, there are several explanations for that. One is something that happens when the price of something goes up. People look for substitutes, and there was certainly a lot of switching to natural gas. People started putting more insulation in their houses. Motor vehicle manufacturers were egged into making much more efficient vehicles, and all sorts of things like that. So it did work. And the other thing that we've seen more recently is when the price of natural gas skyrocketed in Western Europe as a result of the Ukraine war. Somehow Europe managed to cut its consumption quite a bit. So that is a very, very excellent question, and it's difficult, but it will have effects, and it obviously some of us are still going to be doing some driving. We may be doing less, or we may be spending less on other things. So that I think I can say with a fair bit of confidence that things, the higher interest rates will make a difference. But there's no question that higher oil prices make it more difficult. Yeah. John.
Interest rates, you touched on that. I wonder if you could expand somewhat. When the rates started to go up in Canada in spring of 22, a number of economists were predicting rates would start to fall within 6 months.
Yep.
The fall came, and they said, well, maybe the spring.
Yep.
23, and then the fall of 23. And now we're in the fall of 23, and they're talking about 6 months again for rates to come down. Now, you touched on that. So Bank of Canada wants inflation at 2%. It isn't there. It's on 4. I wonder why, in all kinds of press, they are touting this almost imminent decline in interest rates. But why would they decline? And isn't there a danger if they were to decline, that go back to where we were?
Well, I think economists was once labeled the dismal science, and I won't go into the story of why that happened. And I think economists are always trying to find a bright side since they're involved in the dismal science. So that's not an answer to your question, John. But I can tell you that look, I could have done this whole talk on economist sins, but I didn't think that was a good idea. One of the things that I find that business economists don't do terribly well is getting the timing right. They may have the direction right, and there's some wise guy once said, if you're going to forecast often, so eventually you'll be right, which does nothing to increase your confidence in the profession. And it is a mistake that people make. And what happened, and the governor of the Bank of Canada said this outright in Vancouver in December, this was the effect of these things were much greater than we anticipated. And that's a relative polite way of saying, we miscalculated. And I give him credit for having the guts to stand up and say that. Obviously, Donald Trump would never admit a mistake. And so I do think, John, what I tried to do was to suggest caution and suggest that interest rates would be coming down. I mean, 100 basis points in a year is not a whole bunch for the 5-year bond, and 70 after that is not a whole bunch. And I think they will come down. But when I said in that slide, not down to the level of the pandemic, I mean, I have now heard 2 speeches, one by the woman I referred to as on the Bank of England Monetary Policy Committee. The other day, Carolyn Rogers, who's the Senior Deputy Governor of the Bank of Canada, said, look, we need to understand the fact that there are enough underlying inflation pressures that once we get it to 2%, if we're going to keep it there, we're going to have higher interest rates than we did before. So again, John, your question is absolutely valid. I do believe that we will see some lower interest rates. Tiff Macklem, the governor, did a speech the other day and said, you know, it is possible that rates, and he was talking about the policy rate that he sets, will come down before we're absolutely where we need to be. And you know, anytime the governor says something, it's significant. We once had a governor, a newly minted governor of the Bank of Canada, who didn't quite get how significant it was when he said something publicly. And he walked out of a meeting and the press were there and they said, what's going to happen to the Canadian dollar? He said, I think it's too high. The Canadian dollar dropped like a stone the next day, and he had to come back on and try and backfill. But he learned his lesson. He didn't do it again. So I think once the Bank of Canada has confidence that both inflation is fairly stable at 2% and that inflation expectations are stable, I can't think of any other reason unless there's some other crisis like a currency crisis or something that would stop interest rates from coming down. Again, great question. Yeah. Sorry, I'm just going to come down because I'm having trouble hearing. Carbon tax. Okay. So we are in, I said earlier that one of the challenges that economists face is that the economy is constantly changing, and we are in a big change right now. And by the way, change is good. It may drive you crazy, but if we never had any changes, we would be in much worse shape. So the big deal is switching from carbon-based fuels to electricity or perhaps nuclear, and how do you do it? And that is a really big change. So the carbon tax was intended to make you, how shall I put it, maybe do a little less consuming of carbon fuels, and you can do that several ways. You can drive less, you can buy a car, a regular gas car that gets better mileage, you can buy a hybrid, you can buy an electric car. I guess you could ride a horse, but that doesn't seem to be very popular. And then the idea was that some of that or all of it would be redistributed to the lower income group so that while they would pay the carbon tax, it would show up in the cost of their various fuels, but they would be compensated so they wouldn't be worse off. So on paper, it seems to be a very decent idea. Like the GST, when it first came out, people don't like it. And there is a certain senior Canadian politician who is leaning on that. And I will say, I think the Liberal government made a big mistake when they carved out an exception, because if you do it for one person, you're going to have all sorts of requests to do it for somebody else. So I think that was a serious policy error. But I guess what I would say to the one senior Canadian politician who says that he will rescind the carbon tax if he becomes prime minister, okay, show us what you're going to do. Give me something that you think is going to work better or that you can prove that will work better. The point is, the thing that matters here is not whether there's a carbon tax in Canada. The thing that matters is that we've got a climate change problem, and one of the serious parts of the solution is to spend less time burning carbon. That's really the issue. And so if the carbon tax, I mean, it looked good on paper. If it's not working, then, okay, let's change. But give me some ideas about what you want to do. Unfortunately, that particular senior Canadian politician has not given us a policy yet. Firing the Bank of Canada is not a policy. It's a cheap, stupid political trick. I could say a lot more about that because I happen to know something about that topic. Defunding the CBC is not a policy. It's carving out to the right. But this is an economics discussion, so I'm going to stop the politics right there. Great question. Yeah, sorry. Yeah.
Hi, Peter. Thanks. Can I ask you an HR question?
Sorry?
I want to ask you an HR question.
Yeah, okay. Okay.
Years and years, when inflation was up 2 or 3%, the salary increases were at 1.5%, and no one ever asked me why there was a difference. Last year, the consumer price index was up to 6%, and salary increases were at 4%. And everyone asked me, why is there such a difference? And I have no idea what the
Yeah.
answer is, and I wondered if you knew.
I'm not sure that I know, but I'm perfectly willing to make a guess. And we've seen this actually with the labor negotiations over the last several months. I think, well, frankly, I was surprised that employers had not apparently recognized what their employees were going through. Now, I realize you're running a company, you've got all sorts of financial constraints. And I think we've had strikes that have gone way longer and cost companies way more because they didn't get the point. I think that in some cases, it's simply that budgets would not handle it. But I think in a lot of cases, it's just that, you know, hey, do you people who are running companies and setting these policies actually understand what your employees have been going through? And that sounds like a dumb answer. But I can't, honestly, Barb, I can't think of anything else. Yeah. Jessica.
Okay. So many of my questions, I have like a whole list. So many have been answered already, so thank you, and thank you to everybody who's been asking them. So mine, right now, I understand that you need to raise interest rates to control inflation. But as someone who has seen their housing costs rise so much, I also know that increasing interest rates increases mortgages, lines of credit, and rent, which impacts inflation. So it seems to me that there's like maybe a sweet spot. And there's a lot of Canadians that have owed a lot of money on housing or have already been facing really high rental costs, especially in the GTA and Vancouver. So if there is a sweet spot for raising interest, I feel like they've overshot it and maybe should have stopped and sat for a little bit to see what the impacts of those rate increases were before they kept raising the increase. So for me, I'd like to obviously see the rates come down much faster than April, but do you think that they were too aggressive and that there is a sweet spot?
So first of all, a very smart question. I would expect no less. And you are not alone in raising that question. Yeah, you raise interest rates, it feeds into the rate of inflation. So what are you doing? And the answer is, the simple answer is, you are temporarily contributing to inflation, but the ultimate effect of that will be to reduce demand, and that will reduce inflation. I mean, that's the simple answer, but it does absolutely nothing to help you. I did make reference to something that for many years, the policies that we had, the Bank of Canada used to wait until you could kind of see inflation happening. And then they changed this policy, it's at least 20 years ago, that, wait a minute, the first time you see a sign of anything, you start clamping down because you just have to raise it a little bit, which I think is what you would like to see. And it worked famously. Well, the chart I showed was from, I think, 1995 through till September of this year. And it was working. You could see from the chart that it was working perfectly well there. So that's one thing. I will be the first to acknowledge that there's lots of debate in the economics community about whether the bank has gone too far. Now, the difficulty that the bank is facing is, and I think I touched on this, how blunt a tool monetary policy is. You raise interest rates today. What you know is that it will take between 12 and 18 months for those interest rates to take effect. And so you're trying to make decisions, and you don't know exactly what you've done. So that makes it difficult. However, if the Minister of Finance had called, I would have said, if you guys cut government stimulus more sharply, you've got to be careful how you do it. You don't want to hurt people. But I think what you would find is that could have substituted in reducing inflation from some of the interest rate hikes. Now, I'll say one more thing. One of the popular questions that get raised these days is, if you take the inflation caused by interest rates out, wouldn't that be a much lower inflation rate? And I watched a video the other day. I happen to know one of the governors, deputy governors of the Bank of Canada, because I used to go and see her before she was deputy governor. She was Sharon Kozicki, and she's very smart and very good. And she gave a speech, and she said, look, we have been through that analysis. And even if we didn't, if we took the effect the effect on inflation of high interest rates through mortgages, rent, whatever, it really is a very minimal difference, which surprised me, but I have enough faith in her that I don't think she would have said it if it weren't true. But you are right. I think there are ways that the adjustment could have been done with less pain. It would have been a much more complex process. I mean, the thing about running monetary policy, you only got a couple of levers, and you can do something quickly and effectively. Making massive changes in federal budgets is admittedly a much tougher thing to do. But I firmly believe that we're going to have to learn to do that, because I heard a great paper from a former governor of the Bank of Canada at the same conference. He said, look, we're going to have big demands from government. And if we're going to pay for them without taxing people out of sight, we're going to have to figure out what not to spend. So, yeah, good point. Yeah. Any others? I know we're getting close to the end. Yeah. Well, I think, yeah, I mean, and the change is always difficult, there's no question. But I think if any of the demographic work that's been done, and I've spent a fair bit of time on that in the past, if any of it is valid and true, what we're going to find out is the problem is not to find jobs for people. The problem is to find people for jobs. Now, every time you have a big change or a big policy, there are going to be exceptions where people are going to get caught out. I mean, one of the reasons I think globalization is out of favor is that a failure by policymakers, they said, well, if overall a trade deal makes things better, it's good. They didn't pay enough attention to individuals. But everything that we think we know says that we are going to have trouble finding people. And so that will be one of the things that will substitute technology. But there's also a human cost. Frankly, I mean, I do a lot of stuff with my computer, but I like talking to people. And I actually had to go into the bank branch the other day and thoroughly enjoyed it because I got to talk to somebody. My computer is not a great conversationalist. So yeah, you're absolutely right. Absolutely right. Yeah.
So I'm just, I'm cognizant of the time that you've given us. And I'm just wondering, first of all, I really want to thank you for all of this. I think I've learned more in the last hour than I ever did in introduction to economics classes at university, so thank you for that. But I'm wondering if you could kind of summarize things a little bit about what are some of the most important things you've learned?
That's a fabulous question. So a popular definition of what economics is that it is the study of the allocation of scarce resources. So I think the most important thing I've learned is that the scarcest resources are not what you might think. It's not gold or silver or lithium, which is becoming a big deal, or Bitcoin. It's stuff that we can't manufacture, we can't mine, hopefully we can encourage. And it would be three things. Perspective. The ability of all of us, particularly policymakers, to look beyond what we're doing. How does it fit in? We need more perspective. We need a way more common sense. Okay, we've done the analysis, it's really sophisticated, we've used ChatGPT, we've used, does it make sense? And only humans can do that. And then the third thing is we need more judgment. We didn't get into this today, but there are too many politicians who want to run things on rules about budget deficits, rules about this. They don't work, and we could take 20 minutes talking about that. So we need more willingness to make good judgments. And if we had that, I really believe that we would have much better economic policies, and we'd all be very much better off. So I have received a signal that it's time to bring out a little-known commandment, which says Thou shalt not mess with thy minister when she is telling thee that it is time to stop talking. So thank you so much.